and do today. About podcasts and audio assignments, what are the kinds of things that you all want to hear about? Who'd like to start? James?
I'm here to listen and to learn.
All right. So just very good.
I don't know how you're doing it already.
All right, so what's involved and at what levels are people already doing that?
More technology.
What's
Yeah,
that?
what tools are you using?
There we go.
How do I make you use mine?
What tools and how can I convince you to use Kaltura? Very good. Tom?
My name's Tom, and I'm addicted to Canvas. We've already spoken about
This is
it.
it.
Okay, good.
Yes.
Making sure I'm showing up to the right place. I'm interested in how people use it in like non-journalism and non-comp classes.
Okay.
I've seen podcasts been used in those sorts of scenarios where they're training for a community of practice. Like they're going to be journalists and they need to know how to make a podcast. But
Okay. Maria?
Hi, I'm Maria. I am interested in learning about assessment for finance. If folks focus on production value or how they communicate to students around that.
Yeah, good.
I'd be interested in learning more about how course integration.
Oh, Jeremy. Sorry.
I didn't get a chance. Yeah, no, I think I want to hear more examples of how people are using these in their classes. And specifically, I've been thinking about turning my class into a kind of an online or a more blended class. And so thinking about efficient ways to produce some of the content as podcasts.
Okay, good. Mandy?
I was gonna say, it's sort of on the assessment, but more just the balance between production level and content, and how to get students to understand that. So in creating podcasts.
So for student created podcasts.
Yeah.
I'm just gonna leave it real long like that.
Yeah.
I'd love to know a little more about what the student experience has been like what were the challenges and what were the opportunities that folks listen to?
Okay. Also related to Mother.
I am less interested in podcasts and more interested in audio assignments.
Okay.
And I've used a lot of external tools as I have struggled with the Canvas tools for that specifically. So I don't know if there's actual advantages or not to using the Canvas tools.
Okay.
Just to clarify yours, are you saying for students to listen to audio or to provide?
To submit.
Okay, thank you. Well, first I'd like to thank everyone because now you gave me ideas for this question.
And that's part of why we do this here.
Yeah, so
Awesome.
Thank you too.
You're welcome. Man.
Yeah, I guess I'm very interested in like copyright issues with like soundtrack for the podcast or sound effects. Because I think I get it, and then I start looking, I'm like, no, it looks like nothing is legal to be used. So that's number one. And then number two, going off of what I was just asking, what podcasts are people assigning as something to listen to in their coursework?
So non-instructor produced content. Content as podcasts. We're talking about instructor produced.
Like curated podcasts, I guess.
Yeah. Curated, good.
I'm Carolyn, and I guess I'm most curious about that balance. Big field and could be a big project, so how to
Very good. Lisa?
I'm Lisa. When I walked in, I actually forgot why I had signed up, to be honest with you.
We want that kind of participant to come back just out of habit,
But
not even know
I
why.
think there is some role for audio in the course I design, and I just want to know what tools do people use? How do they edit? Really the basics.
All right, good. Jennifer?
I'm Jennifer. I'm a project assistant with Do It, and I'm interested in how people scaffold podcast, student creation of podcasts for students who aren't in communications or where they're just scared to try it.
Yeah, and again, it's that doability, is it?
Well, is there anything left?
All kinds of stuff.
Thank you. Many of you have said, already covered lots of things I'm interested in. So I came here interested in instructor-produced podcasts as a learning tool. And I'm most interested in how students respond to this and how students learn from it. I've been toying, I teach an online class and I've been toying video assignments and students respond really positively to them. It dawns on me that podcasts are really accessible on an everyday basis. You can walk around and listen to them. And so the accessibility might make them popular with students, but I want to know to what extent I should choose a podcast format versus a video format in online lectures in particular. And the format of the podcast itself, should it be conversational or should it be lecture style? A couple of people talking versus me talking on traditional teaching. I would certainly want to learn about all of these things.
All right, see, they didn't take all of the things, they came up with two other ones. All right, so as we go through our conversation today, if you have something to say about any one of these topics, we probably aren't going to be able to do a thorough job on all of them, but maybe there are some things that we can look at. So let's look, for example, at, should we start with instructor-created podcasts or maybe even curated content podcasts and then move to, it seems like it'd be easiest to just sort of curate some and say, list of these as an assignment, and then, they're not covering everything that I want to be covered, so I'll make some more, and then, that was interesting and a good experience for me too, because I had to think about what I was creating and how to say it and what I should leave out, so maybe I can make it into an assignment for the students. So does that seem like a good progression? Curation, construction, and then assignments.
Oh, heck yeah.
All right, good. So
Can you write that on the board? That order?
maybe,
curation, instructors.
would anyone like to start talking about one of those things?
One of the things that I enjoy as a listener of podcasts is it's an opportunity to go in depth. So in the arena of curation, finding that subject matter that doesn't take any shortcuts. When you really want to hear a conversation play out and have students get a foundation of what the situation on the ground in a particular discipline is, that's a real area of opportunity, and because their attention is almost drawn inside, it's a more reflective medium with less just fatigue of paying attention to visuals, because there's that sense that we have to keep things short. I'm not sure exactly where that comes from, but part of it is just the attention that suffers when things aren't paced real well, but it's a little bit different in the audio medium, and it may give you an opportunity to not put shortcuts in that are apart from what we want to accomplish with listening.
It really is a long form, right?
Mhm.
It's not sound bites of news, it's not the visual snippets that we have on slides, but it is more of a deeper thing. And it's also more intimate because you're right,
Yeah.
somebody's whispering right into your ear, and that is very intimate. So it gives people an opportunity to sort of slow down, unpack, and sort of zone out, because we do it oftentimes while we're just sitting around, or it's easy to get lost when people are talking to us. That's really cool.
I'm interviewing. I think this question that you bring up is super interesting, how the availability of cues and of information shapes processing and retention of information. That's a question for a cognitive psychologist, which I'm not. But I was wondering about another format, which would be a voice over PowerPoint. Maybe this counts as one of the audio formats that we're covering here. If that could focus attention on keywords and visuals, of course, it loses the portability factor. But I was wondering if people have used a voice over PowerPoint and how students respond to it. Especially, I think this would be especially relevant in an online course or a blended course.
I can speak to that a little bit from having a little bit of experience using it in classes as well as seeing it used in classes.
Yeah.
Voiced over PowerPoints are great, except that again, they have to sit down and watch it. It's not something that they can usually watch on their phone unless the PowerPoint is just like single words or a couple of words on there, because the phone is too small for that. What you gain from having a voiced over PowerPoint as opposed to doing a sole podcast is the ability to have the visual connection, because your brain cognitively processes visuals with audio better than just audio by itself, and also retention is longer. But at the same time, the length of time that you can have for a video as opposed to a podcast with relation to having those sorts of visuals, the amount of time it takes to create that is still longer, because you're creating both the visual and the auditory. And also, students lose attention to video faster than they do a podcast, because they have to sit still. Podcasts, they can move around, they can be cleaning their apartment or doing something while listening to it. And when you have a video, it almost has to be under 10 to 15 minutes, otherwise you're going to lose that attention very quickly.
Yeah, something about the attention span. We can pop back into an audio attention span, but that visual, it's hard to go back to. It's like reading and then getting interrupted and where was I? Whereas with the radio, we do it all the time.
Yep.
In conversations, we do it all the time. People interrupt and we just go right back to it. So there's something. There's also a connection, and you talked about the cognition of it, with stories and storytelling. We are a storytelling species, right? This is so much of how we learn from the very, very early ages. So it's, in some ways, we've got a lot of experience with it already. So it can help make powerful. James.
It's kind of perverts what you're saying right now, the value of the storytelling. But one of the benefits of voiceover PowerPoint or slides of any kind is you can search then within that for specific content, so the user has a different level of accessibility. If they need to search for a specific item you were talking about in the 43rd minute, they can do that now with certain tools anyway.
So, and that's actually a thing about any of these audio or analog forms, is that they're harder to do than text is, you can scan through very quickly. With even great search tools, you've got to go and back. And the videos, you can hover over and maybe you can see the images show up above of oh yeah, there it is. We're talking about that now. But there's something about the analog format that on the pro side forces us to slow down. On the con side, now where was that? Do I have to listen to the whole thing over again in order to find out where that was?
Well, now
That's a level on the accessibility of the podcast itself, right? Because a lot of podcasts like This American Life have the actual transcripts
below
it. So if you need to go back and search for something, even if you don't remember exactly, you can go kind of through that. But then not all podcasts do transcripts, and even those that do sometimes the transcript isn't always as accurate as you want because they're not directly reading. It's more of a script that they started with and they never edited.
And we should add this, right here, that idea of accessibility. So transcripts, adding the transcripts adds to the doability of the sort of, oh my gosh, it's one thing to just record myself, but now I've got to go through and write it. Or conversely, I've got to write it, now I've got to perform it. And then if I perform it, is it natural anymore, Lauren?
So at the risk of being difficult,
Yeah.
you know, I've recently started listening to audiobooks when I drive, for example, because I drive a lot. Or I think about podcasts like the NPR ones that you're mentioning. And when you have an intrinsic interest in that audio, then yes, you pay attention and you get something out of it. But I can't tell you how many times I've been sitting, driving, listening to the radio, and I totally wasn't, like, it was there, but it didn't engage me. And so when you're talking about podcasts for students, it's great if they're intrinsically interested in your content, but if they're not, and they don't have any visual, what do you have that tells you whether or not they got anything out of it? How do you
At least
know?
in the video, you've got visual hooks as well as the audio
Right.
hooks. Jeremy?
Yeah, no, this was, I was also gonna add with my experience of assigning a lot of these, so around the bigger notion of curation, you know,
And
Like
can you
the-
unpack the experience that you have?
Yeah.
Just for people?
Yeah, so, but first, I just want to say on curation, the notion that, podcasting is a place where people go deep on a lot of things. There's also just like such a huge range that it's really like you search for a keyword and there'll be a podcast about it, right? Like there's gonna be content out there for you. It's a question of like what you want to bring in. But yeah, the biggest thing I found, so I assign podcasts as like, I teach a class on podcasting, so I decided to take half of the readings that I would do and jettison them and assign podcasts instead. And so, you know, whatever the theme is that week, I'll try and find some podcasts that I think are decent about that. But it means that I spend an entire class, if not like a week and a bit, just teaching students about listening and what it means to listen. Like we know how to read and how to make notes on the text that we read, but yeah, like most of my students are listening while they're running on the treadmill. They love it. They say, I love the podcast way better than the reading because they're accessible, because I can do them whenever I want. But if you then just turn to them and say, hey, so what'd you get out of that show? It's a different conversation than, hey, what'd you get out of that article? Because they know how to highlight, they know how to sort of make things. So rather than fighting with that, it was like thinking about how do I go through a listening exercise with them that says like, here's the kinds of things you should be listening for. Here's how you make notes on them. Here's how you like pick out the parts that you want.
At which point you're not cleaning your apartment or, you know, riding the bus
Right,
or
and they
driving.
can, like, I mean, I
because
actually,
you can't do that.
I tell them to do that because that's how a lot of people listen. But I also then say like, you also then need to probably listen to it again in a more focused way before you come in and talk about it, right? So it's like, what do you get out of it just on a first pass? Because that'll tell you a bit about the production of it, right? Like, where did it catch your attention? Where did you fade out? And that will get you to think about like, what choices did they make that I wasn't then paying attention to, right? Why did I tune out? I think those are valid things.
Yeah, and but that also goes back to the idea that they are, these stories, these audio things are part of our life from the get-go. But oftentimes we don't know how to listen to each other either, right? And there is this idea of listening to lectures and the instructor in front, but there again, you've got the person who's cueing you in on this I want you to pay attention to, and do I see you not paying attention? And you know, you can go around. You don't have that feedback with podcasts. You don't have that sort of extra visual element to help. So it does require that you relearn how to listen in that sort of more focused way.
Can I just ask Jeremy a question? So I'm interested in the student experience. So if you've replaced half of the readings with podcasts, do students like that, like them better? And then the performance question, do they actually do better when the readings are replaced with audio?
So the most frequent request I get is, why do we have any readings in this class?
I see.
Because the readings tend to be the denser theory about like what sound means and like how to listen and things like that. So they want everything to be turned into a podcast. They really like the podcast. They, like, I forget who was mentioning it, but it depends on what your interests are. Some students will gravitate towards some shows, some people hate these other shows. Depends what the topic is. In terms of performance, it's hard to say. I feel like the content is in the podcast is mostly used to spark a discussion both about production techniques and about the theme of the week, which is often related to cultural issues. So I feel like it achieves its goal in the ways that the readings do. Sometimes the readings are hard, so that can be stifling for discussion. But sometimes, I ask them what they thought about a show, and they didn't pay attention to the right parts of it, and I get frustrated. So I don't find it any more. I don't necessarily find it's more or less successful than readings. It always depends on like how I set it. I mean, some shows really I do think work well for the theme that work better.
So I'm teaching an online class, and I have little videos of myself explaining things and little videos from pop culture, and then a whole bunch of text that I wrote. And it's a new thing, and I've just done a mid-semester evaluation yesterday. Feedback is everybody loves a video and nobody likes a text. So it's weird because they want an online class, right? They don't want a traditional lecture. But it seems like there's something about these alternative formats that the students prefer.
So at that point, do you ask the students when they say, oh, why didn't you give us a podcast for this? You say, yeah, that's a good idea. Can you go find me a podcast that will replace this reading, and start having them do some of the curation? Because then they have to learn, they have to do the article and then find an equivalent podcast. And
I haven't done that yet, but I've thought about ways in which podcasts could be less curated by me and more curated by them, but haven't instituted it yet.
Jennifer.
Well, I was just going to speak sort of from the perspective of a student who's had podcasts assigned, and I think it kind of touches on everything we've been talking about. So in terms of paying attention and then the curation and the student experience, for me, what's been most successful is you go over some, difficult concepts in lecture, like biomechanics or physics or whatever, and then the podcast is an application of that. So one of the great things about podcasts that I like is it's made for a broad audience, not a specialist in whatever you're studying. And so when it's an application of what I've been learning in class, it's a little more accessible, like not going into all the scientific details that maybe I was learning, but then it's also showing me, okay, how is all this tricky stuff I was learning in lecture, like how does it matter in real life? And so it's kind of an opportunity to mull through, see if I can understand why something's happening in real life in the podcast discussion based on the principles that I learned in the lecture.
Podcasts are very good at providing examples, right?
Yeah.
Like we talked about something and then here's, let's say about a version of this. So in many ways with Universal Design for Learning, they talk about multiple means of expression, multiple means of representation, multiple means of engagement. Podcast would be another way to say, here's the content in a different format. Or maybe here's an initial overview that you need to go into more depth with the reading, or a different podcast, more specialized podcast. But yeah, it provides an alternative, additional way to engage.
From the sounds of it it seems like when people have assigned podcasts, it's been go and do it on your own. I actually listen to podcasts with my students. I teach high school level. So we'll listen to something short and I'll be able to pause just to be like, does everyone know where we're at? Like, this is what's happened so far. I'll give a summary and then we'll listen to the rest. And I've noticed that doing that helps them to start getting the idea of like how to listen, how to engage in a community. So then if something's funny, you can tell like 4 people laugh versus all of them laugh, And then like my personal story is I was assigned a This American Life episode, Trail of Tears, when I was in a survey of American Indian course. And I listened to that podcast and wrote a report, and then it was a radio program. I've been hooked ever since. So that's the other thing I wanted to just mention about podcasts. It's like, it's the one thing from college that I've completely dove into afterwards and share with family and friends and like, share the education. So I just wanted to bring up those 2 points. And I am curious if other people have done group listening.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I did the same thing. So, I TA'd a few years back for English 100, and a lot of English 100 instructors follow, like, they share lesson plans and things like that, and one of them is This American Life podcast. It's like from a few years back, number one party school, it's a very popular one.
Oh, and Madison's in it.
Yeah, and no, it's not Madison, it was when it was Penn State.
Penn State,
Yeah,
too.
it was Penn State, but, there's like, somebody created this really great worksheet that like, you sit in the class and you listen with them, and then the worksheet like has them as you're listening, filling out this worksheet about like, what is the main point, who is talking, what is going on, what are the sort of audio bits that are going on, and it's like just, and you don't even really have to prep them for it because the sheet walks them through, but you're doing it in class, having them listen, because then one, they're forced to pay attention, they're seeing that everybody else is paying attention, and that kind of helps. But it also gets them to think about this, and then once you're done, you stop and you talk about, but what did you guys fill out, what did you do? And then they share ideas, and somebody's like, oh, I didn't hear that, that's what's going on there, oh, okay, and so they like learn how to listen as a group. So then I did the same thing, I gave them the exact same sheet, minus the like particulars of This American Life, and said, go out and pick a This American Life or pick a different podcast and do the same thing on your own. And that allowed them to come back with some of the same sorts of things. And that's a really good way to get them to think about how to listen. And it starts with the group listening first. And then it got students actually hooked on This American Life. So a lot of them.
Bonus.
I would also say if you want to like, at the public listening we do in our class, we do a public listening once, and then they go through individually after with headphones on and type into SoundCloud. So I don't know if you've seen SoundCloud, but you can annotate different parts of the podcast or the audio file. So we actually have student record of comments on particular moments of a show. So we do this like collective listening, but then there's this, after you've done that collective listening, kind of go into a specific sound file and collectively annotate it, which is kind of a neat group activity.
So for Jeremy's examples, this is his page, and he's got a link to his course site here if you want to go in and start on your own. One of the things that's kind of fun about it is that the students, that I thought was really cool, was in the blog, the students create podcasts. And instead of just creating a paper and handing it in for the instructor to read and nobody else, these are out for public consumption. They have created something very thoughtfully that they can share with friends, with family, and total strangers. It reminds me of Anna Scopes has her students create a webpage on Weebly where she has them investigate a specific gene and a disease that is associated with that gene, and then they create a web page that is a very high quality web page. They spend all semester on one page, and then she has them put a little world global tag of map of a hotspot map of who's accessed it from around the world. So then the students can continue to go back and say, oh, somebody from Australia accessed this, somebody from whatever Australia. And all of a sudden it becomes more important that they create good work. So it's kind of a fun, there's something really powerful about that authenticity.
So is there a Psychmetrics tool that's free?
For podcasts?
So for websites, no, they.
For websites, yes. If we can find the Onoscope activity sheet, we can put it in the notes of our activity sheet for this. Yeah, there are several of them. Some of you might know them all. And
You mean for the website creation or for tracking who has access?
that little map
Yeah, I don't
spot
know
in
if
the
we
corner.
would have that. Like check.
I mean, Google Analytics, but I don't know if you can post
Can
it.
pay for it, it's very on that.
Yeah, well, and you could do the Google Analytics, but that's not as, it's not as easy as it is. It's not as easy as having a little map of the world in front of you.
Yeah.
Automatically
That's
show up.
awesome.
Is that an easy filter?
I believe that it is a third party tool. It's been a while since I. James?
My question is, you're answering it sort of. When you started the conversation thinking about podcasts, it's great for examples or a narrative and whatnot. I see the value of it. UW-Madison's disabled podcasts with an essentially supported tool because you can't track analytics in deep, complex ways like you can with video, or even reading, like you can't see what page they're at or where they viewed it from, or how it's embedded, or all of that is stuck in our system really deeply, and audio just doesn't have that way of tracking the analytics. So for an instructor who wants to know, did my student just click on the page and saw that they viewed the page in Canvas, or did they actually engage all 48 minutes of this content or all 3 hours? And all the assessments I've heard so far were sort of third party. It's a manual piece of paper, or it's a really cool active creation after the podcast. But podcast itself doesn't really have any tracking, which can be a problem for departments who support this.
But you can do podcasts in Kaltura.
You can. Technically, we don't have them enabled or supported, but I'm open to doing so. That decision came before me.
Okay.
So I'm kind of here seeing if there's a valuable need for that. It requires some creation of new things.
And what that would do is that would give us all of the Kaltura tracking analytics.
Yeah, it would give you the Kaltura tracking analytics. It'd be easily embeddable. You could choose whether it was just audio or had slides incorporated. There's a lot of potential here. Yeah.
Okay.
And it's easy. Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. Good. Lauren?
Have to be difficult again.
If you're always there, you don't
I
have to say
know.
it every
Right.
time.
I want to make sure that I understand first what you're saying, that it was disabled because the analytics that track the amount of time a student spent listening
This was
is not
before
available.
Kaltura, the podcast. You're talking
Well,
about the podcast.
Kaltura or
being-
otherwise, that was the issue.
That's a very small, yeah, that's a part of the issue. Part of it was disabled, as I understand it, because of the manual creation process that took not only the user, but the admin side of it. So every podcast required a dual setup, which was complicated. And yeah, the analytics tracking didn't work the same using Google Urchin codes the way that it does with a video player.
And
See, my issue with that part of it is pedagogically, I don't really care about the time spent. I care what they get out of it. And
Right.
so when things get blocked because you don't have the analytics about how much seat time somebody spent, really?
While I agree with you, the other side of it is
Sorry.
there are big schools like this SMPH, for example, is huge on knowing the specific amount of time
And
that their
somebody needs
users
to talk to
engage
them about
content.
what's really
Because
important. I'm sorry.
But that's how they prove mastery, and that's how they prove that they can give somebody accreditation that they completed the content.
Yeah,
course,
see, and
you
that
know?
goes back to the old language labs where they would, slide somebody's ID or whatever, check off that they walked in there, but who knows what they were spending their time doing.
Well, and the whole
It had
idea
nothing to
of
do with
mastery
mastery.
equals number of hours that you spend in your seat in the class
Mhm.
with an instructor.
Well, that's what's cool, like with videos enabling IVQ, you can do the assessment within the actual media itself.
IVQ and video quizzing.
Oh, yeah, sorry,
Kaltura,
yeah.
turned on.
Not
That's
IVs.
where I like this idea of being able to create your own sort of like annotations or narration over top of it with something like VoiceThread or you said SoundCloud does that. That's the perfect way. Because I think pedagogically, you don't want to take them out of the experience they're in. You want them a part of that flow and focus within the learning moment. It takes place within that media. That's why we don't want people to leave campus once they're in it. We want them to stay there, not open a bunch of other tabs or whatnot. It's the same with if we could assess someone within a podcast, have them reflect, engage, or comment from there, that's valuable.
I mean, how do people feel about using the video player to load in the podcast?
A lot of people do that.
That's exactly what we've done in the past.
Mhm.
And then
That's the only option you have now.
podcast doesn't really, it just shows, it looks like a video. If you
Yep.
embed it, it looks like a video.
Yeah, if
And
we just change the sizing of it.
It
so it's
does
short.
everything that, are there advantages to what else is enableable?
The advantage would be we could change the proxy so that you could subscribe to it through iTunes, things like that. Yeah. right now you can subscribe through MediaSpace, what do you do? But if you want to do it through your actual podcast player, then
Right.
that requires an admin to set up a different server that can change that.
So being able to turn it into a tool that they are already using
Yeah.
outside of academic.
Exactly, which is the right move, but that's why it's been disabled.
Yeah. David,
I've been helping an instructor this semester layer a podcasting assignment on a CommB course. And this is something a little bit new for the instructor. And one of the challenges is in aligning the construction with goals that are not about construction per se. They're more about oral presentation, like practicing that and getting feedback and iterating. So what are the assessments that are actually correct, and how do you use technology in a way that is integrated across many different weeks? It's not just like one and done. And it's not even necessarily about subscription. Like they might produce 1 or 2 files, but it doesn't rise to the level of like podcast capital P. And so it involves some of the things that have already been mentioned, like kind of like reverse outlining a curated list to understand what the components of a podcast are. But it also includes like pitching and planning and reflecting, like how are you going about integrating your writing into a new form?
so really there's the introduction of that takes an already complicated thing of a pitch or even a presentation. And this is, to Carolyn, your point, is this doable? Is it an overwhelming thing? Or how do we scaffold to get to the point where we can actually have the students focus not only on how do I do a presentation, now how do I add the technical elements to it? How do I hone this so that it's there's a good pitch to it and it grabs their attention. And in the meantime, I'm listening to all of these really awesome podcasts that have been honed over years and years and years, and I'm comparing my little piece of crap and my terrible voice that I hate to hear, and I listen to this fantastic, well-produced thing. Is there a sense of, I don't know, just, what's the word I'm looking for? Do people get discouraged? Do the students get discouraged as they do this?
It's fitting because there's that great quotation from Ira Glass, father of This American Life and podcasting, about how being creative, and you've probably heard this before, so I'm going to paraphrase though, about kind of you're creative, you've got a good ear, you have good taste, and so then it's hard to kind of critique yourself harshly because you're comparing yourself to what you would want it to be like, and kind of just keep making, keep producing, keep doing your skill and your passion until you can get to that point. But yeah, it is hard that persevering through that.
Jeremy, do your students run into this at all? Do you watch them grow from like the first one that they do to the
Yeah,
ones where they come out confident?
I guess what I wanted to say was I designed the class knowing that some students will have audio editing experience. But it's meant to be a class where if you've never touched an audio editing program at all, you can go from 0 to. So I designed my assignments and even our like in-class labs in a graded way that you can, if you're a bit more experienced, you can do option 3, and if you're not, do option 1.
Okay.
That said, mine's a fortunate class where like I spend, 1 day each week doing an audio lab where I teach them how to do some of these things. So there's some very specific skills I'm looking for. But I don't, anytime I talk to other people about doing podcasts in their class, it's really quite easy to do. And now there are a lot of tools that make it very, very easy to do. So I don't think people should be afraid just because like you're not going to create like the next This American Life episode. But you know what I mean? You're going to have something that's good, and I think the student put a lot of effort into it. On that, I was just trying to open up this app called Anchor, which is literally like you press the record button, you're talking, then you choose some music to go behind it, and it automatically scores the music so that it goes down when you're talking and comes up when you're not. You can add transitions. It's like build a podcast by adding a couple of audio files and sound bites. It's super So it's like, it's as easy as saying, grab your phone and do this, and you could do it in like I could do it right now for you. Or you can do the more complex thing, which is like, we're gonna learn how to use Adobe Audition, and you're gonna create a really good show.
That's Anchor.fm for those watching at home. Not a UW Madison supported tool.
Yeah.
Your mileage may be
None of mine are, sorry.
Yes and yes, but also, I actually brought a podcasting kit that Merritt checks out. I believe InfoLabs also have pieces that you can check out, and those links are
Not as
on.
fancy.
It
Not
looks like,
fancy,
it looks
okay.
like this.
Okay,
It's just,
well,
there's no bag.
Same company then.
Zoom.
Yeah.
Zoom.
so it's a Zoom mic?
Yes, yeah, that's what you can get a college library too.
Okay. So, and in some ways, like, even the idea of, do I check out a podcasting kit is sort of there's a lot of pieces there.
Pretty easy though.
Yeah, but they look really
They
complicated.
look really complicated.
You
They
know?
look really complicated, but we have instructions and we can get people to use them in less than 10 minutes.
Okay,
So, and we did them with a bunch of high school students last spring. We had 25 high school students who used them without with minimal instruction. I think we probably gave them like 10 minutes. We went through it and then they started and without any real issues.
What high school? How did you get these high schools?
It was a Team Scholars Program because we worked with school ed, so they all created a podcast focused on education topics.
That is a phenomenal
this is what?
This is a phenomenal tool. It has four different kinds of microphones inside of it. It doesn't look as fancy as that, but it has 4 microphones.
Really? Yeah.
Oh,
it
it's two,
We have 3.
three.
Three external mics.
Yeah.
Okay.
That is four microphones. You can have it do surround sound. You can have it do one-way directional. You can have it be the one that's facing you, the one that's away. It's
Yeah, but that's got XLR for fancy
And then I'm
stuff.
gonna guess that once you have this, and you've got it on your SD card or whatever, you can very easily upload it to this and add in the extra pieces.
Yeah.
So,
Just get one of those, the Blue Yeti one, the best thing.
or $65 for a snowball.
And you can get your students to buy them because for $100 you get the microphone and a free video game. Like, oh, shit. I'm serious. It's like the best deal on the market. The Yeti mic's great.
So the takeaway from this short little piece is, technically, it's easy to do. This still doesn't this still doesn't address what are the elements that are involved in the presentation element and the how to do a pitch or how to even tell a story for a podcast. That's different from writing a paper. It's different from. You're pointing to this. Does this tell you?
No, I was sort of raising.
Raise your hand. Yes, Mandy. Mandy.
Well, yeah, I was just gonna say that like the other thing is that a lot of this is talking about like somebody mentioned non-com classes, right?
Yeah.
You're going to non-com classes, and we last year worked with 2 non-com classes that were doing podcasts. One of which was an anthropology class that was talking about the anthropology of sound as a whole. And they were creating a podcast for that. And another was a Spanish language course that was not just demonstrating podcasting, but demonstrating language proficiency.
Great.
And so there's all not just for communication, for giving a pitch, for writing, those sorts of things. Sometimes it's for like experiencing soundscapes, and sometimes it's for creating or demonstrating language proficiency for students. So there are other examples than just standard trying to get a point across.
And this goes to your question of, format?
Yeah.
Do you do the lecture? Do you do a conversation? I can see for language learning, a conversation as a podcast would be a really fantastic example. But it could also be an example where you have something where you say, all right, you take position A, you take position B, you take position C, based on having read an article or specialized in article A, B, or C, and now hash it out in an audio format. It won't be, that initial hash out will not be a beautiful polished thing, but that's okay. I'm not looking for that right now. We'll get to that later on. First, I want you to have a conversation. AJ.
I had a follow-up question on my thing about copyright. So Anchor, when you produce it, is it all 100% yours?
Yeah, so as far as again, I haven't used it in my classes, so I haven't gone through the terms and agreement, because it's like fairly new, their ability to add music and do all this stuff, so it's now a tool that's very simple that I might do like a very initial one with, but all the music, my understanding is it's like copyright-free music that they can just, and I mean, the bad news is that, you know, there's only so many templates, so it's gonna start sounding the same, but there's also a site called freesound.org, which has a bunch of free sounds on it, so those are free to use. The students in my class, because I feel like it's an educational assignment, and they're posting it to a class blog, you know, I tell them, don't worry about copyright for your submission to me. If you want to use your favorite song to be the intro music for a little bit, I'm fine with that. But if you're going to go and do something with the show after, you need to know that you are going to possibly face repercussions for them. But it's such a gray area that I don't want it to hinder their ability to do work on what I think should fall under fair use.
David,
I was just gonna say, one of the technologies that I'm kind of excited to use with beginner podcast assignments is Microsoft Sway. And the reason why is that when you think about what podcasting is, when you collect all the media, it's actually multimedia. It's text, it's images, it's, show notes, and it's the audio. And what is the audio? It's bits of recordings that are put in a sequence. So that's my answer to a beginner course that isn't a course on podcasting, but is a means to another course outcome. And so this is part of the Office 365 suite. The NetID components are there. There's group level sharing, there's individual level sharing, there's a public face if you want it, but it's not as exposed as Anchor FM is. And so what you're doing is you're essentially creating a single URL that can be submitted, and the ease of sort of working within a Canvas environment. But then what you have is a web page that contains audio that you can apply to another kind of evaluation criteria. So organization, appealing to the identified audience, like sort of having a global set of things that you're trying to do, but not necessarily expecting that broadcast quality. Because I've been recording audio for years, and I always record my audio too low, and it's just, it's not a realistic expectation for everybody to achieve that level of perfection that we think of when you're doing it for both technical proficiency as well as all of those conceptual considerations.
let's take just a second and talk about the Canvas environment. So Office 365 has a LTI, Learning Technology Integration, what is it? Interoperability component that lets it connect with Canvas so that we can have those single URL assignments. Then can probably build a rubric in SpeedGrader to talk about, is it appealing and what does that mean, and all of those things, so we can actually probably put some good broad assessments. I don't know if I'm sure they would vary depending on whether it's a podcasting class or a get your pitch across class. But then you've got that sort of safe closed off environment, so it's the individual student and the rest of the class, but not necessarily out to the big scary world. So you don't have to worry about that level of scariness, unless you want to, then you can post it on Anchor FM or something like that. Or I bet you can post the Sway just with a permission, make it available.
Yeah, absolutely, you can. And the thing that I'm excited about is that I think we're really close to having like a sort of generic module that could include a rubric that is sort of an integrated, whether it was a single audio assignment or an integrated assignment that had various checks. Like maybe one step is that they're doing a transcription and then doing reflection and an assignment based on what they glean from each other's
So
transcription
you're
work.
building a module in Canvas, so rather than a Canvas template, you have a module that I can import into my own course eventually.
Right,
soon.
right.
So
And it is
maybe
based
you'll let
on
me know
this-
so I can share it out.
Yes, yeah, and I mean, it would be sort of in this COM-B framework, so it might not work,
Right.
completely universally, but
You can adapt it.
an adapted kind of thing, yeah.
All right. We are almost out of time and I want to be respectful of that. Are there any last minute things that you're like, we didn't talk about this?
Really neat if there are any more tools that people want to throw out there. We heard
Yeah, Sway, Anchor FM, what else? We have Kaltura.
Audacity.
Audacity is sort of the gold standard in many ways, right? It's got a little bit higher learning curve. What?
I have a problem with its user interface, but.
Right, it's
I was gonna
difficult.
say, so do I.
It's been
It's
around
a long
standard
time.
and it's
Time
free.
became that way.
It
It's
is-
free, that's
Right,
the
okay,
thing.
that's what there's the gold part.
We
Yeah.
used something called Soundtrap last year.
Sound trap,
Yeah, I got an educational license for it.
okay.
I think it was cheap, like $150 for 50 seats or something.
Jeremy had mentioned SoundCloud. And again, he's got examples on his link to the page, which you can go to.
This, in the teacher education building, there's a podcast studio that's available for folks to visit.
And is that available for folks even if we're not in the School of Education? Okay,
We'll make it work.
all right,
And the
there you
kids are
go.
also, we have 4 of them, and those are also available for checkout too.
Okay,
and those are general
General checkout. These ones I think actually are general checkout. If you think if you want to use them for a course or something, it might be nice just to touch base, so we make sure they'll circulate out of the library, so that people know.
just gotta
And
know
you'd
the
be
secret
welcome to use
contact
those
person,
cases
name to
too.
drop.
So we could
All right,
check in.
So for people who aren't teaching about podcasting but are checking out equipment from any of you who offer it, if you had like 3 or 4 things that you would say are the must-dos to students so that they get a halfway decent recording, what would those
oh,
things be?
I know the number one, microphone.
Well, it's built in,
Oh, yeah,
right?
right,
So
okay.
if you have to be in a certain kind of setting or be aware of certain things in your setting that would help, or I don't know,
Hold
just,
your breath in the room, and if you can hear noise, it's not a good place to record.
okay.
Make sure that you are recording.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah,
small
headphones help.
spaces. Yep.
Turn your phone off,
Yeah.
sound for sure. No one likes that sound in the middle of a recording.
Is there maybe a handy dandy tips list for recording podcasts that
I
you
have
could
some
share?
stuff.
Talk
I'll
fast.
say what I have for a handout for podcasting.
Okay,
Maybe
that
can you
would
send
be
that to us
Yeah,
and we will
I'll-
add it,
I will
link to
look
it
at
at the
it.
bottom of the sheet if you will.
I would also say just like know where the microphone is on, just so like a lot of people will be like, oh, I have a microphone on my computer, and they'll just read here, and it's gonna sound like you're far away, right?
Yeah.
Know that your microphone on your phone is here and hold it there, be close to the microphone. And record in a room that is not a big reverberant space like a bathroom or a big hall like this. Recording in your closet is great.
What if you're out on the
Seriously.
street,
With all your
like,
fur
Oh,
coats.
yeah,
in
I
a
mean,
conversation with somebody, is that a totally like you definitely
Terrible.
shouldn't do it sort of thing, because there's too many background noises, or?
You just
Proximity is the
Yeah,
biggest thing,
okay.
so if you can record close and then just trust your ears, like playback, did I get it? Because, a person on the street is like a way legit means of,
Yeah.
capturing information, you just gotta be real close.
Well, that goes back to Maria's test, make sure that it's on, listen to it before you let that person on the street walk away and say, did we get this good? Yeah.
One thing I think is true of audio is if your main narrative is really high quality, almost any low quality is acceptable. And I've heard in a lot of podcasts, like, if you didn't quite hear that, this is what they said, and you repeat it. So
Oh,
you
right.
still get the emotive expressions from the person you recorded, but it's a horrible quality, but you get the idea that they just say that's what they said.
Okay.
And telling students to read from a transcript, they'll have less vocal fillers, all the good speech things, and then they have a transcript too, already made for them.
You can kind of tell when they're reading though.
Yeah,
It
but I
loses
mean, you
the
can learn to be
emotion of
natural
their
about it.
connection to it. so.
Yeah, but good speech practice, you always have something, right? At least cues or something to follow.
Yeah.
You can still teach them that good practice.
We need part 2 of this. Okay, so that actually brings me to this purple sheet. If there is more that you'd like to learn about this thing, under the other comments, tell us, we need a part 2 of this. Or if there are any other topics you'd like to see. We are now starting to put together a list of topics for next semester. Again, in the other comments, please, if you want to hear something about Sway or Office 365 interoperability or something like that, let us know. Please help us out. Thank you again all for coming.